The night it happened was the kind of night small towns like to erase from memory. The streets were quieter than usual, the lamps burned dimmer, and even the stray dogs seemed uneasy. The victim, a young man known for laughing too loud and attracting both admiration and resentment, left the town's only bar after midnight. His steps were uneven, not just from the alcohol, but from the uneasy sense that someone was following him. Whoever trailed him knew his habits well, the shortcuts he took, the back streets he preferred, the way he never looked over his shoulder until it was too late. NTHE attack was swift and merciless. A knife, a blow, the kind of violence that didn't happen by chance but by intention. The young man collapsed into the grass, choking on his last breath as his eyes stayed open, staring into nothing. But the crime did not end with the killing. The body was dragged, carefully and deliberately, across wet lawns and behind fences, hidden not in haste but with calculation. By dawn, when someone finally found him, his throat was cut, his expression frozen in shock, as though demanding that someone speak his name and seek justice. NBUT justice never came. The town's first reaction was not outrage, but silence. A silence heavier than grief, because it was not born of confusion, but of recognition. The murderer, they all sensed, was not some drifter or stranger passing through. He was one of them, someone whose face they passed every Sunday in church, whose handshake they'd felt at the market, whose children played alongside their own. That familiarity changed everything. It turned horror into complicity. NTHE sheriff, standing over the body, seemed to understand this instantly. He pulled his hat low, not against the sun, but against the shame that threatened to meet his eyes. He wrote the report without urgency, already deciding which details would be omitted, which truths would be folded into silence. The townspeople watched him, relieved in their own way. If the sheriff wasn't going to press too hard, neither would they. Better to call it bad luck or a random tragedy than to pull at threads that would unravel everything. And so the murderer walked home that night without fear. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, sat down at a warm supper table, and smiled at his family. His neighbors saw him the next day and nodded politely, their eyes sliding past the unspoken truth. The crime had been absorbed into the town like water into a sponge, soaking in but never spilling out. The knife had ended one life, but it was the silence that strangled the rest of them. Children grew up in that silence. They learned not to ask why certain streets were avoided after dark, why certain names were whispered only once before being forgotten. Even those who had been too young to remember the night itself carried the weight of it. They inherited the knowledge that something had happened here, something that was never to be spoken of, and thus the murder became more than a single act of violence. It became a covenant of silence, a pact written in blood, binding the town together not in unity but in fear. The house that sat at the edge of town was the kind of place people passed quickly, even in daylight. Its paint peeled in long curls, the shutters sagged on rusted hinges, and the weeds in the yard seemed to grow faster than anywhere else. But it wasn't the neglect that unsettled people. It was the man who lived inside. Everyone knew his name. Everyone knew the weight he carried. And yet, no one ever spoke it aloud in connection to the night of the murder. When the killing first happened, suspicion had drifted toward him like smoke. He had been seen near the bar that night, standing in the shadows, his face lit for a moment when he struck a match for a cigarette. More than one witness recalled his shape lingering in the distance as the victim stumbled down the alley. But when the sheriff asked, the details blurred. No one wanted to say they were sure. No one wanted to be the one who pointed a finger. In a town like this, pointing meant drawing the whole weight of silence and hostility onto yourself. NTHE man was left alone. No charges, no questions, just a quiet understanding that it would be easier, safer for everyone if he simply melted back into his house at the edge of town. And that's exactly what he did. For 20 years, he lived like a shadow. He went to work when he needed money, picking up odd jobs that didn't require too much conversation. He kept to himself at church, sitting in the back pew, never singing, never joining. Children whispered about him, inventing stories that painted him as a monster who only came out at night. Their parents didn't correct them, but they didn't encourage it either. The whispers were safer than the truth. NTHE, truth was unbearable. Everyone knew what he had done. They knew the way his eyes lingered too long on the victim's sister when she passed in the street. They knew the way he tightened his grip on his glass in the bar when anyone mentioned the old murder. They knew the sound of his boots walking home that night, heavy and purposeful, echoing down streets that had fallen silent. And yet, no one could say it aloud. NTHE sheriff aged into gray hair and slower movements, but he carried the same silence. He had once sworn to uphold the law, but the law in this town was not written in books or upheld in courtrooms. It was whispered in kitchens, decided in glances, agreed upon in the heavy silence of a shared meal. The sheriff had chosen his side long ago. Protect the town. Protect the illusion. Protect the murderer, if that was what it took to keep the town from tearing itself apart. And so the town lived with it. They raised children in the same streets where blood had once soaked the grass. They opened businesses, hosted fairs, celebrated weddings, and buried their dead, all while pretending the young man who had been murdered was simply an unfortunate memory. His family left after a few years, unable to stomach the indifference. Their house stood empty, a rotting reminder of a grief no one wanted to acknowledge. But silence does not remain clean. It rots, festers, grows heavier with each passing year. And in this town, the silence began to seep into every corner. Friendships fractured under the weight of unspoken knowledge. Couples whispered bitter accusations late at night, blaming each other for knowing too much or too little. Children grew into adults who carried an unease they could not name, a mistrust of their neighbors that came from watching the adults around them avoid the truth for so long. NTHE man at the edge of town felt it too. He felt the way their eyes slid away from him, the way no one spoke his name unless they had to. At first, he found it comforting. Proof that they were all complicit, that no one would dare betray him. But as years passed, the silence began to twist. Every handshake felt hollow. Every polite nod in the grocery store carried the echo of what was unsaid. He realized that the town's silence was not loyalty, it was fear. They didn't protect him out of friendship. They protected themselves. N-T-H-A-T, fear, began to gnaw at him. In the long nights, when the wind rattled his broken shutters and the floorboards creaked under his own pacing, he would ask himself whether someone, someday, might break. Maybe the victim's sister would come back, demanding answers. Maybe a new sheriff would take the badge, one who didn't owe the same debts. Maybe some child, grown into a reckless adult, would decide that silence wasn't worth the wait anymore. NHE tried to quiet these thoughts with drink, bottles stacked in the corner, empty and useless, but still not enough to drown the sound of that night replaying in his head. He saw the young man's eyes every time he closed his own, the shock, the betrayal, the desperate, silent plea. No matter how many years passed, that look remained fresh, like the wound itself had never healed, and in town, the murder became folklore. People didn't speak of it directly, but it lingered in stories told to children as warnings. Don't walk down the alleys after midnight. Don't trust laughter that rings too loudly in the dark. Don't ask too many questions. These stories were half-truths and shadows, but they all pointed back to that night, even if no one dared say it. NTHE victim's name was erased from public memory. It wasn't spoken in the school. It wasn't carved into any monument. His grave, if it was ever visited, received no flowers from anyone in town. The silence was complete. But complete silence is brittle. It can shatter with the smallest crack. The crack came on the 20th year. A reporter passing through town on a whim stumbled across an old clipping in the library archives. The murder, the unsolved case, the whispers of a suspect never charged. It was the kind of story that demanded attention. The reporter asked questions. He knocked on doors. He interviewed old residents who had grown tired, loose with their words, and slowly the silence began to falter. Some residents tried to stop him. They told him it wasn't worth stirring up. They warned him that the town didn't like outsiders digging into their past. But the reporter smelled something heavier than resistance. He smelled fear. And fear was always a trail that led to truth. NTHE, man at the edge of town, knew the silence was over the moment the reporter arrived. He could feel it in the way people looked at him, sharper now, edged with panic. He sat in his sagging chair, cigarette burning low, and waited. He had lived 2 decades in the safety of silence, but deep down, he had always known it wouldn't last. Murder leaves stains that time cannot wash away. When the truth finally came, it wasn't with a confession, or a trial, or a jury's verdict. It came in whispers turned louder, in neighbors finally daring to say his name, in the way the sheriff, old, worn down, and broken, finally admitted that he had buried evidence all those years ago. The town's silence collapsed under its own weight, spilling into the open. And with it came the realization that they hadn't just hidden a murderer. They had all become accomplices. NFOR 20 years. The town had carried the crime like a shared burden. And when it finally cracked, it destroyed more than the man at the edge of town. It destroyed their faith in each other, their sense of community, their ability to pretend they were innocent. The murderer had killed one man, but the town's silence had killed the truth. The years stretched on in Hollow Creek, and while the town tried to resume its rhythm, the presence of the hidden murderer seeped into every corner like an invisible fog. By the time the third year rolled around, whispers of the unsolved killing had woven themselves into daily life. Markets thrived, children played, families gathered in their quiet rituals. But beneath it all, there lingered a sharp unease. The murder had not been of a stranger, nor an outsider passing through. It had been one of their own. That truth made everything heavier. People no longer spoke of the crime directly. Instead, they built layers of silence around it, avoiding names, dates, or even acknowledging the victim's absence. Yet, every locked door, every suspicious glance, every hushed conversation was a reminder that the killer still lived among them. Perhaps they were the butcher who cut meat a little too carefully, the farmer whose eyes didn't quite meet yours, the schoolteacher who smiled too widely. No one could know for sure, and that uncertainty became its own prison. There were those who remembered the night vividly, the screams that had cut through the autumn air, the dogs howling restlessly as though sensing something was wrong, the church bell swinging without a hand touching it, clanging in the darkness. Stories grew distorted with each retelling. Some said the victim's spirits still walked the edge of town, standing at the window of the abandoned inn, waiting to point toward the guilty. Others insisted that the murderer left strange tokens on doorsteps, a feather soaked in something red, a shard of glass glinting like a warning. None of these claims could ever be proven, but they gave the townsfolk something to cling to, a way of breathing life into the unspeakable so it didn't crush them in silence. NTHE police files had long since grown dusty, tucked into drawers, forgotten by officials who were either too afraid to pursue the truth or too tired to stir up the past. Yet not everyone in Hollow Creek accepted the quiet burial of justice. A man named Elias Harrow, whose brother had been closest to the victim, refused to let go. Every month, he would gather old witness statements, scrawl theories in the margins, and walk the same streets where the blood had dried years ago. He spoke to shopkeepers, farmhands, even travelers who had passed through at the time, piecing together fragments of memory into something resembling a map. He claimed he could feel it, the shape of guilt bending around him, watching, taunting. His obsession made him an outcast, for no one wanted the peace they had so carefully built to be shattered by truth. But Elias could not forgive the quiet complicity that kept a killer safe. Meanwhile, the murderer blended deeper into the fabric of Hollow Creek. They learned when to speak and when to stay silent, when to feign sympathy and when to turn away. They had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, becoming part of the very background that no one questioned. But deep inside, the guilt was not silent. It pulsed, whispered, sometimes screamed. At night, the murderer dreamed of the victim's face, pale and unfinished, asking questions without words. They heard footsteps in their own house, though no one was there. They began locking doors against shadows that had no source. Some nights they walked to the very place where it had all begun, standing over the spot where the earth had once been stained, whispering apologies that only the trees could hear. To kill was one thing. To remain unseen for decades was another kind of torment entirely. Then, 20 years later, something shifted. A boy exploring the woods stumbled upon a rusted knife buried beneath roots, its blade still marked with traces of old blood. The find reignited long-dormant suspicion. People began remembering details they had suppressed. An odd glance, a peculiar smell, a moment that seemed small back then, but now glowed with sinister weight. Suddenly, Elias Harrow's obsession no longer seemed like madness. He pulled at threads with renewed force, forcing neighbors to face questions they had long avoided. And as the circle of silence began to break, Hollow Creek stood trembling on the edge of revelation, knowing that the truth would not only expose a murderer, but also expose the decades of quiet betrayal that had allowed them to live free among friends. By the time 2 decades had passed, Hollow Creek no longer looked like the same place where the murder had first happened. New families had moved in. Old shops had closed. Children had grown into parents. But even with the passage of time, the murder remained like a wound that had healed badly, covered on the surface, but aching underneath. The victim's name had nearly been erased from casual memory, spoken only by the oldest residents in whispers, as if saying it too loud might summon something terrible. Yet in the silence that stretched across those years, the town itself seemed to carry the memory, as though the very soil remembered what had been done. NTHE murderer had become a part of the town's story without anyone realizing it. They attended church, offered smiles at the market, and even helped during town fairs. For all appearances, they were an ordinary figure, trusted and unnoticed. It was this blending into normalcy that allowed the crime to stay hidden for so long. People are always looking for shadows, for figures that don't fit. But the murderer had learned how to fit perfectly. And yet cracks showed in small ways. A nervous twitch during certain dates, a reluctance to pass by the abandoned inn where the blood had first been spilled, a tightening of the jaw when Elias Harrow mentioned his brother's name. These were details too subtle for most to notice, but not for those who had carried suspicion for years. Elias never stopped. He had grown older, his hair graying, but his determination never dimmed. While others tried to bury the past, he carried it like a torch. He collected fragments, an old pair of boots thrown into a shed, a stained shirt left too long in storage, the whispered confession of a drunken man who had once claimed to know more than he should. To Elias, the murder was not just about justice for the victim. It was about truth itself. He believed the town had built its peace on a lie, and that peace was nothing more than a mask ready to slip away at any moment. The townsfolk avoided him now, weary of his questions, but that didn't stop him. He insisted that someday the murderer would reveal themselves, whether by accident or by the weight of their own guilt. That revelation began not with Elias, but with something much simpler, a flood. Heavy rains battered Hollow Creek one autumn, and the river swelled over its banks, tearing into the woods and exposing things long buried. Among the debris dragged into town was a fragment of cloth, stiff with old stains, its colors faded but still recognizable to some. The fragment belonged to the victim's jacket. It should have been buried deep in the woods, but now it lay in the center of town for everyone to see, a reminder that the crime had never truly disappeared. The sheriff could no longer ignore the whispers. Files were reopened, names revisited. And suddenly, after 20 years of silence, Hollow Creek buzzed with the tension of suspicion once again, and FOR, the murderer, the walls began to close in. They had lived so long in the comfort of invisibility that the sudden glare of suspicion was unbearable. At night, they paced their home, rehearsing explanations, crafting alibis no one had asked for yet. They grew paranoid, certain that Elias was watching their every move, certain that footsteps behind them meant the truth was coming. The mask they had worn so carefully began to crack. Those closest to them noticed strange behaviors, bursts of anger, long absences, hands that trembled when they thought no one was looking. The murderer could feel it now, the noose tightening, not from the sheriff, not even from Elias, but from the sheer weight of time finally collapsing in on them. And then came the slip. One night, while drinking too heavily at a local tavern, the murderer muttered words that froze the air around them. "I never meant to kill them." The tavern went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the kind of statement that could have been brushed off, dismissed as drunken rambling, but not in Hollow Creek. Not in a place that had lived under the shadow of an unsolved murder for 20 years. The word spread quickly through town, carried on every whisper, passed in every kitchen and every church pew. By the next morning, the name of the murderer, the person who had lived among them all this time, was no longer hidden. What followed was not a dramatic arrest or a sudden burst of violence, but something slower, stranger. The murderer, realizing the silence of Hollow Creek had finally turned against them, walked into the sheriff's office without being summoned. Their face was pale, their voice hoarse, and they confessed in broken fragments, piecing together the story of that night 20 years ago. They told of rage, of a moment they couldn't undo, of a body dragged into the woods and left to rot. They told of fear that grew into calculation, of living each day as though death itself would call them out. And FOR, the town, the truth was both a relief and a curse. The victim's family wept, not because justice had finally come, but because it had taken so long. Neighbors stared at one another differently, realizing how easily they had accepted a murderer as part of their lives. And Elias Harrow, after years of obsession, did not celebrate. He stood outside the sheriff's office as the murderer was taken away, and he said nothing at all. For him, the truth had not healed Hollow Creek. It had only confirmed what he had always feared. The town had chosen silence over justice, and in that silence, the murderer had thrived. NTHE case was closed, but Hollow Creek was never the same again. The wound had finally been reopened, and though the murderer was gone, The town could no longer pretend it was innocent. They had hidden the truth for 20 years, and in the end, it wasn't the law that uncovered it. It was time itself, dragging everything buried back to the surface. The winter of 1881 arrived in Hollow Creek like a shroud. Snow buried the town in silence, muting even the smallest sounds. Wagon wheels crunching on the frozen road, the faint ringing of a church bell, the barking of half-starved dogs. To most, it was a season of survival. Families huddled close to their fires, rationed food, and prayed the blizzards would pass. But for some, winter carried another kind of weight, memory. It was in the stillness of those nights, when the world seemed frozen in place, that the past returned most clearly. NTHE murder, though 2 decades old, still lingered like frost on every window pane. Some pretended it was behind them, buried with the victim in unmarked ground, but others knew better. Silence did not mean peace. It meant something was waiting, watching. Hollow Creek's people had learned to live in that silence, but the victim's family never could. Their grief was not softened by time, only sharpened. Every winter, on the night of the killing's anniversary, they lit a lantern and placed it in the window, as though the lost soul might find its way home. NBY now, the victim's younger sister, Clara, was no longer a child but a woman in her 30s, hardened by years of loss. She had married, raised children, and managed a farm, but beneath her strength lay a bitterness that never faded. Clara did not believe in justice anymore. She had watched too many seasons pass, seen too many false leads and cowardly refusals from neighbors who would not speak. What she did believe in, however, was debt. And to Clara, Hollow Creek owed a debt. Someone had stolen her brother's life, and the town had allowed that thief to walk freely. If justice would not come from the law, then perhaps it would come from another place. NTHAT winter. Strange things began to stir in Hollow Creek. At first, it was small. Footprints appeared in the snow outside homes where no visitor had come. A knock at the door late at night, but no one waiting when it was opened. Horses spooked in their stables, staring at nothing, trembling as though something unseen stood among them. People whispered of shadows crossing fields even when no moon shone. It was unsettling, but easy to dismiss as tricks of winter, the imagination of tired minds. But then came the voices. Families reported hearing soft murmurs at their windows after dark, voices too faint to understand, yet close enough to chill the blood. One woman swore she had heard her dead father's voice, calling her name from the edge of the woods. Another man claimed the sound of crying had followed him all the way from the churchyard to his doorstep. Some dismissed it as wind, others as madness brought on by the long cold. But Clara Harrow believed differently. She believed it was her brother. She believed his spirit, restless and unavenged, was walking once more through Hollow Creek. Clara began gathering those who still remembered, those who had not been entirely broken by silence. Elias Harrow, though aged and weary, joined her without hesitation. A few others, neighbors who had always carried unease about the murder, listened when Clara spoke. She told them the dead could not rest because the living had failed. That hollow creek had allowed a murderer to walk in its midst. That the voices were not warnings but reminders. The debt still had to be paid. In the weeks that followed, the hauntings grew stronger. Lamps flickered on their own. Frost appeared on walls indoors, and the church bell tolled in the dead of night without a hand upon its rope. Fear spread quickly. Families locked their doors earlier, children were kept from wandering, and whispers grew that perhaps the town itself was cursed. The sheriff dismissed it all as nonsense, but his voice was hollow. He, too, had woken one night to find his dead wife's locket laid neatly on his nightstand, though he had buried it with her years before. NBY midwinter, Hollow Creek was unraveling. Trust, already fragile, collapsed under the weight of suspicion. If the dead truly walked, then surely they walked for a reason. And if they walked for vengeance, then someone among the living was guilty. Eyes turned to neighbors, to friends, even to family. Conversations grew clipped, prayers longer, doors bolted tighter. And Clara, who had once been pitied for her grief, now stood at the center of everything. Some feared her, some followed her, but none ignored her. Then, one night, the truth, or something like it, came. A storm raged outside, snow lashing against the windows, when a scream echoed across the town. Neighbors rushed toward it, lanterns swaying, and found the murderer's house dark, its door flung wide. Inside, the murderer lay collapsed on the floor, their face twisted in terror. They were alive, but barely coherent, whispering through broken gasps. He stood over me. He would not stop staring. They swore the victim had returned, that the dead man had stood at the foot of their bed, waiting. Word spread like wildfire. The murderer confessed in their delirium, naming the victim, naming the deed, naming the night 20 years past when anger had spilled into blood. They told of hiding the body in the woods, of burning clothing, of washing their hands until they bled. The confession came not to lawmen, not to Elias, not even to Clara, but to the silence itself, to the fear of seeing the victim returned. And when the murderer's voice finally broke, when the last word left their lips, they went still, their body cold as though the life had been drained away by the very presence they claimed to see. NTHE Sheriff tried to close the matter as natural death, shock, or madness, but the town knew better. Hollow Creek had always belonged to its silence, and now that silence had claimed the debt owed, for Clara, the confession brought no peace. Justice delivered by the dead was no justice at all, but she lit her lantern one last time that winter, placed it in the window, and whispered to the snow, "You may rest now." Yet Hollow Creek never forgot. Even after the murderer's name was carved into record, even after years had passed, the stories of that winter endured. Some said the victim's shadow could still be seen wandering the river's edge when the snow fell heavy. Others swore that the faint sound of weeping lingered outside their homes when the lanterns were extinguished. The town carried on, as towns do, but it did so with the quiet knowledge that its silence had teeth. NFOR in Hollow Creek, the dead did not stay buried. They waited. The town had grown used to its secrets, and by the time 2 decades had passed, silence was as natural as breathing. But one spring morning, long after the murder had been neatly folded into the fabric of small-town life, the quiet was disturbed in the most unexpected way. A new family had moved into the very house where the victim had once lived, a home that had been repainted, remodeled, and yet still carried the echo of something unresolved. The youngest daughter of the family, only 10 years old, began to notice things her parents brushed off: doors that refused to stay locked, whispers when the house was otherwise empty, and the faint scent of cigar smoke clinging to the hallways. The girl didn't know that the victim's husband had been a habitual cigar smoker, a detail buried deep in police files and long forgotten by most. At first, her parents dismissed her claims as childish imagination, the sort of exaggeration children create when faced with a new environment. But as weeks passed, small incidents began to trouble them as well. The father would lock up the shed only to find it wide open in the morning. The mother swore she heard footsteps in the kitchen when everyone was asleep. When the girl insisted she saw a man standing in the corner of her room one night, the parents began to grow uneasy. They confided in neighbors, and it was then that whispers of the past began to resurface. People who had refused to speak for years started telling half-remembered stories about the night of the murder, about how someone had been seen leaving the house under the cover of darkness. NTHE. More they listened, the more the family realized they were living in a house not just haunted by memory, but possibly by the presence of the killer himself. They brought their concerns to the local police, and though the case had been ice-cold for decades, a new detective, young and eager to make his mark, decided to revisit the file. He interviewed old witnesses, compared forgotten testimonies, and re-examined evidence that had been collecting dust in storage. The strangest detail came from the girl's description. She said the man in her room wore a heavy brown coat, a peculiar detail that matched the clothing described by one of the original witnesses on the night of the crime. No one had spoken of that coat in years, and the files had never been made public. This coincidence sparked new energy into the case. The detective began looking into men who had owned such a coat at the time. What he found was chilling. A respected member of the community, someone who had been at the center of local events for decades, had been known for wearing that very coat. He had been questioned briefly during the original investigation, but dismissed quickly due to his social standing and alibi. Yet now cracks appeared in his story. Old records didn't match his timeline. New forensic methods, applied to the clothing fibers kept from the original crime scene, revealed a link. And suddenly, the figure who had lived comfortably among friends, neighbors, and even sat in positions of authority, was pulled into the light as the possible murderer. When the arrest finally came, it shook the town to its core. The man was not just a neighbor, but someone who had been trusted with children, who had volunteered in local projects, who had built his life on the trust of others. The betrayal was unbearable. People asked themselves how they could have lived beside him, spoken to him, smiled at him for all these years without knowing what he had done. The family who had moved into the house moved out almost immediately after his capture, leaving behind a community that struggled with the weight of guilt and disbelief. And as the trial unfolded, the most haunting realization of all settled in: the murderer had never left. He had been there all along, shielded by silence, by trust, and by a town too afraid to confront its own shadows. The town had long since convinced itself that the murder was a thing of the past, a wound healed by time and silence. But the truth was never gone. It lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to claw its way back into the light. That moment came 21 years later, when an old storage unit was auctioned off after decades of unpaid rent. The contents were unremarkable at first glance: dusty boxes of clothing, broken furniture, yellowed newspapers. Yet buried beneath the clutter was a small, locked trunk, its surface scarred with age and rust. The man who had purchased the unit forced it open in hopes of finding something of value. What he found instead was a collection of items that would reopen a case the town thought buried forever. And inside the trunk were personal belongings of the murder victim: jewelry she had worn, letters she had written, and even photographs that should have been in the possession of her family. Most disturbing of all, there was a blood-stained shirt carefully folded at the bottom of the chest. The man, unnerved and uncertain, reported his discovery to the authorities. When detectives examined the items, they quickly realized this was evidence that had never been cataloged in the original investigation. It wasn't simply memorabilia. Someone had hidden it. NTHE discovery forced the town to confront a truth it had avoided for decades. If these items had been deliberately concealed, it suggested the killer had not acted in isolation. Someone had either helped him or, at the very least, protected him. The detective in charge reopened the investigation, poring over the old case files and comparing them with the newly found belongings. The blood-stained shirt, when tested using modern forensic methods, yielded something investigators had never had before: DNA. It didn't match the victim, it matched someone still alive. The results pointed to a man who had been part of the community all along, a figure so ordinary that suspicion had never lingered on him. He had lived quietly, married, raised children, and attended town gatherings without ever drawing undue attention. But the DNA didn't lie, and when confronted, his story began to unravel. At first, he denied any involvement. Then, when pressed about the trunk, his composure cracked. Witnesses from years ago were brought back in, and their old statements suddenly seemed sharper in the light of this new evidence. One had mentioned seeing a man leave the victim's house the night she was killed, carrying something bundled under his arm. Another recalled the accused man behaving strangely at work in the days that followed. And as the case gained momentum, the town was forced to reckon with its own complicity. People began asking why no one had questioned him before, why whispers of suspicion had been ignored, why the investigation had been so easily dismissed when the trail went cold. For years, neighbors had chosen comfort over truth, unwilling to believe one of their own could be capable of such violence. That collective silence had allowed the murderer to grow old in peace, while the victim's family carried their grief alone. When the trial began, the courtroom filled with familiar faces. Those who had once trusted the man now sat across from him, forced to watch as the details of his crime were laid bare. The prosecution painted a chilling picture: a man who had taken a life, hidden the evidence, and relied on a community's unwillingness to see what was in front of them. The most haunting part was not that he had killed, but that he had continued to live among them for so long, unseen for what he truly was. NTHE guilty verdict, when it finally came, did not feel like justice. It felt like an indictment of the town itself. For 20 years, a murderer had lived comfortably in their midst, his secret protected by the silence of others. The truth was no longer hidden, but the cost of its discovery left a scar that no passage of time could erase. The town had grown used to forgetting. That was the only way it could survive the weight of what had happened. People didn't speak about the murder anymore, and if the victim's name ever slipped into a conversation, it was quickly buried under coughs, small talk, or a forced change of subject. 22 years had passed since the night she was killed, and in that time, the story had faded into little more than a whispered cautionary tale told to children who wandered too far after dark. NBUT forgetting doesn't erase. It only buries. And one summer evening, the ground shifted. NTHE trigger came in the form of a letter. It arrived at the local post office, addressed not to a person, but simply to the town of Coldbrook. The envelope was yellowed, the handwriting jagged, as if written in haste or desperation. Inside, there was no greeting, no signature, just a single page that read N. The one you've hidden lives among you still. Look to the house with the locked cellar. Look before it is too late. NTHE sheriff at first dismissed it as a cruel prank, but the words spread quickly through the town, carried on gossip and suspicion, until it reached those who remembered the murder too well. The mention of the cellar was not lost on them. 20 years ago, there had been rumors about one particular house, a home on the edge of town where the blinds never opened, where the owner had once been questioned but never charged. At the time, there hadn't been enough evidence, and the investigation had shifted elsewhere. But now, the old unease returned with a vengeance. Curiosity turned into action when a group of teenagers, emboldened by the mystery, broke into the property one night. What they found beneath the cellar floor would unravel everything. The room was small, lined with crumbling stone, and the air was suffocatingly stale. In one corner sat a wooden crate, nailed shut. They pried it open with a rusted crowbar, expecting rats or old tools. Instead, they found clothing. Women's clothing, stained and torn, some pieces carefully folded, others crumpled as if discarded in haste. Among them was a scarf the victim's family had always said was missing. Terrified, the teenagers fled, but word of their discovery spread fast. The sheriff, now unable to ignore the growing storm, obtained a warrant to search the property. This time, the evidence was undeniable. Beneath loose floorboards, investigators uncovered more hidden boxes filled with items that once belonged to the victim. Her watch, a pair of earrings, even letters she had written to a friend. Modern forensic testing revealed traces of blood on several objects, too degraded for the old methods of the 1990s, but conclusive under new DNA technology. The results pointed squarely at the house's owner, a man who had lived quietly in the community ever since. He had never married, never moved away, never left the town where his crime had been buried under silence. When confronted, his expression barely changed. Neighbors who had known him for decades described his demeanor as calm, almost resigned, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. And during the interrogation, he confessed in fragments. His words were not the dramatic unveiling of guilt the town expected, but instead, chillingly matter of fact. He admitted to killing her after an argument spiraled out of control. He admitted to hiding her belongings in his cellar, but he refused to say why he had kept them or why he had never fled. NTHE trial drew national attention, but for the people of Coldbrook, the greater pain was not his guilt. It was the realization that they had lived beside him for 2 decades, never questioning, never seeing. Some recalled moments when he had seemed odd, but no one had ever pressed further. Others remembered the night of the murder, and how quickly suspicion had been redirected to strangers who passed through town. It became clear that the murderer's greatest ally had not been his own cunning, but the town's willingness to look away. NTHE guilty verdict closed the legal case, but not the wound. Families began re-examining other unsolved crimes, fearful of what else might lie hidden beneath their silence. The old letter was tested for fingerprints and DNA, but no match was ever found. To this day, no one knows who wrote it, or why they chose, after all those years, to break the town's fragile peace. Some say it was guilt that pushed an accomplice to finally speak. Others whisper that the victim herself had found a way to reach across decades to demand justice. Whatever the truth, the letter had shattered the illusion of safety. NTHE Town learned then what it had refused to accept for 20 years. Forgetting is not the same as healing. Silence does not protect. It only delays the reckoning. And when the truth finally emerges, it does so with a weight no community can easily bear. The summer heat pressed down on Coldbrook the way guilt presses down on memory, thick, suffocating, and inescapable. By then, the town had endured weeks of unease after the cellar discovery and the trial that followed. People tried to move on, to tell themselves that justice had been served, that the nightmare was over. But beneath that fragile comfort lingered a question no one wanted to voice. If he lived among us for 20 years, who else might have? It began again with a rumor. A retired school teacher, Mrs. Ellery, had been sorting through old papers in her attic when she stumbled across a box she hadn't touched in decades. Inside were essays from her students, most dated from the year of the murder. As she flipped through them, one stood out. It was written by a boy named Thomas Vale, a quiet student who had since moved away. The essay was supposed to be about my summer vacation, but his version described sneaking out at night, watching Mr. H carry something heavy into the woods behind his house. NTHE name wasn't spelled out, but the initial matched the surname of the man just convicted. The essay went further, describing how Thomas had, quote, seen him digging while something wrapped in a sheet was beside him. Mrs. Ellery had marked the paper with a stern red, "See me after class." But when she turned to the back page, she realized she had written no follow-up notes. At the time, she had dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination. But now, with what the town had just endured, the words made her blood run cold. She took the essay to the sheriff, and investigators followed the lead into the woods Thomas had described. Decades had passed. The trees had grown thicker, trails had vanished, and storms had reshaped the landscape. But after 2 days of searching, cadaver dogs alerted to a patch of ground near an old oak. Beneath the soil, they unearthed something that would change everything: a shallow grave, and inside, the skeletal remains of another victim. NTHE discovery tore the wound wide open again. Suddenly, the trial everyone thought was the ending became only the beginning. The victim in the grave was not the woman everyone remembered. She was someone else, unidentified, forgotten, another ghost, swallowed by the town's silence. Forensics dated the bones to around the same period as the original murder. It was possible the killer had struck more than once. Yet there was no record of a missing woman who matched. No family had come forward. Whoever she was, she had been erased so completely that her identity was now only bones and fragments of clothing. NTHE realization horrified the town. For 20 years they had convinced themselves they'd lived beside a single hidden killer. But now the truth seemed darker. If he had killed more than once, why had the murders stopped? Or had they? Was there another victim buried somewhere, still waiting to be found? NTHE sheriff tried to bring the convicted man in for further questioning, but he only stared in silence when asked about the second body. Sometimes he smiled faintly, as if amused by the town's horror. Sometimes he closed his eyes as though he was drifting into sleep. NTHE weight of the silence spread through Coldbrook. Neighbors began to suspect neighbors. Old disappearances were dragged back into the spotlight. Farmhands who had left without a word, drifters who had stayed for a season then vanished. Had they left willingly? Or had they been claimed by the same shadow the town refused to name? One night, Mrs. Ellery received an unmarked envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, faded with time. It showed a group of townspeople at a summer fair, long ago. In the corner of the picture stood the convicted man, smiling faintly beside someone whose face had been violently scratched out with ink. On the back, written in uneven script, were the words, "She was not the only one. NN01 ever discovered who sent the photograph." NTHE's second body was eventually buried in the town cemetery, her headstone reading "Only Unknown Woman, Found 2025. A handful of residents attended the funeral, their silence heavier than any words they could have spoken. NBUT, the letter, the photo, and the grave left a permanent mark on Coldbrook. The townspeople now lived with the knowledge that what they had uncovered was only a fragment of the truth. The rest of it still lingered beneath the soil, in lost memories, in secrets carried by those who had looked away for too long. NTHE Town had thought it had uncovered its darkest secret. But Coldbrook had not finished confessing. The leaves had just begun to turn when Coldbrook learned it could not outlast its secrets. Autumn always brought a false sense of calm, crisp air, golden light, the sound of children crunching through dry leaves on their way home from school. But that year, the town could not convince itself it was ordinary anymore. The past had dug itself up, and no season could bury it again. It began with the church, NST. Marks had stood in Coldbrook for over a century, its bell tower rising over the clustered houses and shops, its graveyard cradling generations of townsfolk. But the church had also become a silent witness to everything unspoken. Some said the murderer had been a regular attendant, sitting in the same pew each Sunday. Others whispered that the pastor at the time, long since dead, had known more than he admitted. A's renovations began on the church basement. Workers stumbled across a section of stone wall that seemed newer than the rest, as though something had been sealed away. When they broke through, the smell that rose up was unmistakable, even after all those years. Rot, faint but undeniable. Behind the wall was a narrow chamber no one had known existed. Inside, they found scraps of fabric, bones of small animals, and something worse, fragments of human remains mixed into the dirt. They were not buried, not arranged, but scattered, as though discarded. NTHE Sheriff's Office tried to contain the news, but in Coldbrook, secrets spread like wildfire. Soon the town was whispering that the murderer had not acted alone, that someone within the church had helped him, hiding evidence, sanctifying his crimes within holy walls. The idea struck like a knife, that faith itself had shielded a killer. Parishioners left in silence. Some swore they would never return to St. Mark's, saying it felt less like a church than a crypt. Others defended it, insisting evil sometimes clings to holy places because it fears them. But no one could explain the chamber or why it had been sealed away so carefully. And then came the journals. In the town library's archives, a volunteer stumbled across a stack of personal notebooks donated years earlier by the estate of Reverend Cole, the very pastor who had led St. Mark's during the time of the murder. The journals were yellowed, the ink smudged by age, but the words were clear enough. Entries described his suspicions about one of his parishioners, a man who seemed to take too much interest in funerals, who lingered in the graveyard after dark. The Reverend confessed his unease, even his fear, but he had chosen silence. To accuse without proof would be sin, one entry read. Better to pray for him than to damn him with words. NBUT, later entries grew darker. The Reverend wrote of waking at night to hear knocking beneath the floorboards of the rectory, though when he checked, nothing was there. He wrote of a voice during sermons, faint but insistent, whispering from the back pew. He is not the only one. NTHE last journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the Reverend had stopped writing and never returned. Days later, he was found dead in his sleep, his Bible open on his chest. His death was declared natural, but now, with the chamber uncovered, the town began to wonder. Some said the Reverend had been complicit, burying what he had discovered to protect the church's name. Others argued he had been tormented into silence by fear. A few whispered that he had confessed too much and someone had silenced him before he could act. NTHE past refused to rest. One Sunday, weeks after the discovery, the church bell rang in the middle of the night. No one had pulled the rope. The bell rope had been cut years earlier, after rust made the clapper unstable. Yet the sound echoed through Coldbrook, waking households across town. Some residents swore they saw the bell tower lit from within by a pale glow, as though a lantern burned there. Others said they heard voices mingling with the tolling, chanting in words they could not understand. By morning, the church was empty, dark, the bell still, but the silence afterward felt heavier than the ringing. NTHE sheriff ordered the chambers sealed again, citing, quote, preservation of evidence. But many townsfolk saw it as an attempt to bury the truth once more. A few left Coldbrook entirely, unable to bear the weight of knowing their community had hidden a murderer, then hidden his deeds, and perhaps even sanctified them. NFOR, those who stayed, the church became a symbol, not of faith, but of the silence that had let evil thrive for 20 years. Every time they walked past its steeple, they remembered what was beneath it. The bones, the chamber, the whispers of the Reverend's pen. NTHE murderer may have been unmasked, but Coldbrook itself remained guilty. NTHE town had thought justice would free it. Instead, each revelation bound it tighter to the past, like a bell that once struck can never be unrung. When Coldbrook believed its ordeal was over, it learned the past is not something you defeat. It is something that waits, crouched in the dark, until you return to it. NTHE murderer had been exposed. His name had been spoken aloud after decades of secrecy. His hiding place had been unearthed, his deeds recounted in hushed, horrified tones. The town should have felt cleansed, but Coldbrook was not cleansed. It was scarred. People stopped gathering on porches at dusk. Children no longer played hide-and-seek between the rows of corn or rode their bikes after sundown. The town, once tight-knit by routine, became fragmented. Families shut their doors early, as though night itself had become infected. NTHE greatest change came in the houses. A woman named Margaret Dobson swore that every night she heard footsteps pacing her attic. Her husband checked again and again, finding nothing but dust and old boxes. Still, the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, as though someone were counting out steps. Across town, an elderly man named Daniel Carr claimed he smelled blood whenever he opened the door to his cellar. The scent rose like steam, thick and metallic, though the space was empty. "It's as if the earth itself remembers," he muttered, his eyes hollow. NTHE Sheriff's Office dismissed these reports as hysteria. Trauma, they said, could manifest as imagination, But those who lived through it knew better. The silence that had shielded the murderer for 20 years had changed Coldbrook in ways that could not be undone. Soon came the dreams. One by one, residents reported waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, from visions of being buried alive. Some dreamed of scratching at wooden lids, dirt falling into their mouths, lungs filling with soil. Others dreamed of running through the fields, only to find the rows of corn turning into rows of graves. And in every dream, the same sound echoed, a bell. NTHE bell of St. Mark's, tolling endlessly, each strike reverberating through their ribs like a warning. NN01 admitted it at first. It was too strange, too shared, but once one person spoke, others joined in. They were dreaming the same dream, as if the town itself was dreaming through them. NTHE mayor called a meeting in the town hall, urging unity. He insisted Coldbrook must move forward, that the past must remain past. But even as he spoke, his own hands trembled, because he too had dreamed of the bell. It was not just the dreams. Objects began to shift. Photographs fell from walls in the middle of the night, shattering glass across the floor. Doors that had been locked were found standing wide open by morning. One family claimed their kitchen table was dragged 3 feet across the room while they slept. Every incident, small or large, carried the same undertone. Coldbrook was not finished with what it had buried. NTHE breaking point came with the river. NTHE Coldbrook River had always been the town's pride, a ribbon of water winding between fields and forests, its banks the site of summer picnics and winter skating. But one morning the river ran red. At first, people thought it was mud churned up from heavy rains upstream. But the water thickened, sticky, clinging to boots and buckets. The stench was undeniable, iron, raw and sharp. Blood, and tests later showed no contamination, no logical explanation. Yet for 3 days, the river carried its crimson burden. Livestock refused to drink. Fishermen wept as they pulled up nets stained with it. Children were kept inside, their parents whispering prayers they had not spoken in years. And after the 3rd day, the river cleared, returning to its normal, sparkling current. But no one trusted it again. No one bathed in it, fished from it, or let their children wade in its shallows. It had shown its truth, and truth could not be unseen. Coldbrook had uncovered its murderer, but in doing so, it had uncovered something deeper, the cost of silence. For 2 decades, the town had chosen to live alongside evil, to protect itself with denial. That choice had seeped into its wood, its soil, its water. NTHE town itself had become a co-conspirator. And co-conspirators cannot simply walk away. In the weeks that followed, more people left Coldbrook. Some packed quietly in the night, not even telling neighbors they were gone until their houses stood empty. Others tried to stay but grew restless, haunted by whispers in the dark, by knocks on the walls when no one stood outside. NST, Mark's remained closed, its bell silent. Yet sometimes, on the coldest nights, the townsfolk swore they still heard it tolling across the fields. Not loud, but faint, like a memory calling them back. And Coldbrook had been a town that hid a murderer for 20 years. Now, it had become a town that could not hide from itself. And as each family left, as each house went dark, the remaining residents began to realize something worse than murder had taken root. NTHE silence had not just hidden evil, it had taught the town how to keep it alive. By the time autumn rolled across Coldbrook, the town was no longer the same place it had once been. Fields lay fallow, porches sagged without laughter, and windows were boarded against both weather and memory. NTHE silence had begun as a shield, but now it had hollowed the town from within. One by one, families fled. The Dobsons left in the night, their house still warm from the stove. The cars were gone by dawn, leaving only empty rocking chairs that swayed, though no wind stirred. Soon, only a handful of homes were occupied. But by the year's end, just one remained. NTHE last house stood at the end of Mill Road, its paint peeling, its shutters hanging crooked. The Gray family had lived there for generations, long before the murderer, long before the silence. They had built their roots deep into Coldbrook's soil, and perhaps that was why they could not leave. Or perhaps it was because the town would not let them. Inside lived Ellen Gray, her husband Thomas, and their 2 children, Ruth and Michael. They watched as neighbors vanished, as lights went out across the fields, until their house burned alone in the darkness. And at first, they thought themselves safe. The river no longer ran red, the bell at St. Mark's was silent, and the footsteps in the attic were only memories. But as weeks passed, the house began to change. NTHE walls groaned with voices, murmuring low and urgent, as if carrying conversations long unfinished. Photographs rearranged themselves, placing long dead faces at the forefront. Ruth woke screaming each night, insisting there was someone sitting at the foot of her bed, a shadow that breathed but never moved. One night, Thomas found the kitchen door wide open, though he had bolted it himself. Outside, the fields were filled with figures, dozens of them, standing in the moonlight, neighbors who had long since left, or perhaps who had never truly gone. Their eyes were dark, their faces pale, as though the land itself had kept them. When Thomas blinked, the figures were gone, but the earth where they stood was flattened, pressed down as though by many feet. Ellen begged him to leave, but the roads out of Coldbrook had grown strange. Travelers who tried to escape often returned, circling back to the same crossroads, the same barn, the same empty lots. It was as if the town had curled inward, a trap that closed upon itself. NTHE Gray family remained, not because they chose to, but because there was nowhere else to go. And as winter deepened, the house grew colder. Fires dwindled quickly, and blankets did little against the chill that seemed to seep from the foundation itself. Michael began talking to someone no one else could see, a man in the corner who told him stories. Ellen asked him what kind of stories, but Michael only smiled and whispered, The same ones everyone here already knows. By January, the town was entirely empty except for the Grays. Every other house had collapsed inward, their frames buckling as though the land had swallowed them. Mill Road, once a path through neighbors' farms, became a corridor of ruins leading to one lighted window. One night, the bell returned. It rang not from St. Mark's, but from the gray house itself, shaking the walls with its toll. Each strike rattled dishes from shelves, cracked glass panes, and froze the family where they stood. Thomas swore he saw the rope swinging in their attic, though no bell had ever hung there. And then came the knocking, NNOT at the doors, not at the windows but from beneath the floorboards. Low, deliberate, as if someone buried beneath the house wanted to come inside, and Michael was the first to answer. In the dead of night, Ellen awoke to find his bed empty, the trapdoor to the cellar wide open. She heard his voice drifting up. "Nen, they're asking for us. They said, it's our turn." Thomas rushed after him, lantern in hand, only to find the cellar empty. The dirt floor had been disturbed, a long, deep furrow carved as though something had pulled itself through. Michael was gone, and after that Ruth refused to speak. She sat by the window, staring into the fields, her breath fogging the glass. When Ellen pressed her, Ruth finally whispered in. They're waiting for the last house to fall. NBY spring, Thomas vanished as well. Ellen awoke to find his side of the bed cold, his boots gone from the corner. She searched the house until she reached the attic. There, written across the walls in his handwriting, were the words, "Knit was never him alone. It was all of us." It was the town. Ellen remained with Ruth, though the girl was slipping away, pale, silent, her eyes fixed always on the fields. The voices in the house grew louder, layering over each other until every room hummed with conversations of the dead. And one final night, Ellen heard the bell, not loud this time but soft, a single, low chime that shook her heart. When she opened her eyes, the house was full. The neighbors stood in every corner, their faces hollow, their mouths moving, though no words came. Then Ruth was gone. Ellen was the last. She walked room to room, hearing the walls breathe, the floors pulse like a heartbeat. At dawn, she stepped outside, and Coldbrook was silent, every house gone but hers. She stood alone at the end of Mill Road, staring across the empty fields. And then she understood. NTHE last house was not meant to remain. It was meant to bear witness, to stand until the end, until the silence was complete. When the sun rose, the gray house collapsed into the earth. No one saw it fall. No one marked the place where it stood. Coldbrook was gone, consumed not by fire or flood, but by its own silence. And only the fields remained, empty and waiting. And sometimes, on nights when the air is still, travelers swear they hear a bell tolling across the dark, and single, endless chime, NTHE sound of a town that hid its murderer for 20 years and never stopped paying the price. And never stopped paying the price.